In this lecture, we're going to take a look at some of the other characteristics of skeletal muscle, and we're going to start with the overall structure, internal structure of a particular skeletal muscle. And so here in this illustration, we have a bone and we have a number of muscles attached to various sites on these bones, but just focusing on this middle muscle here. Here we see the tendon that attaches the bone to the muscle, and the main part of the muscle is just referred to as the muscle body, sometimes referred to as the muscle belly. And what we see is that the overall muscle does have a connective tissue sheath around it, referred to as the epimysium. And so this is the outer covering that separates one muscle from another muscle and helps to maintain that internal structure. And when we take a cross-sectional view, we see that muscle cells are organized into these bundles called fascicles. And each fascicle is separated from other fascicles by another connective layer or another layer of connective tissue called the perimysium. So we're going to start to see layers of these connective tissues that helps to provide this organization to overall muscle structure. And inside a fascicle, we pull out here one single muscle cell or muscle fiber, and those two words are used interchangeably. We see that muscle cells have a unique characteristic in that muscle cells are multinucleated, which is to say that a single muscle cell has multiple nuclei that contain DNA. Around each single muscle fiber is another layer of connective tissue called the endomysium, and the endomysium provides structure to the muscle cell and separates the muscle cell from other muscle cells, as you can see here in this lower illustration. And inside the muscle fiber, there's still another layer of organization, and that is called the myofibril. And the myofibril is made up of protein filaments, and these are contractile protein filaments. And so when these protein filaments interact, that is when force is produced. The sarcolemma is reference to the cell membrane of the muscle cell. So this is the part of the muscle cell that allows molecules and ions to come into the cell and out of the cell. So it's a semi-permeable selective membrane. In terms of the attachments of skeletal muscle attachments are often named a number of different ways, and the muscle attachment refers to the location on the bone where it connects. The first term here is the origin, and the origin is a reference to the specific location where the muscle attaches to the bone. Typically, the portion of the bone that is more fixed, or rather is the less movable end, is named the origin. And the origin of a muscle tends to be more medial or proximal to the axial skeleton. The insertion of the muscle is the other end of attachment of that muscle, and that is the end where it is more movable, that moves a bone, that contributes to human movement. The connections on both the origin and the insertion through the tendon to a bone is continuous with that periosteum, that outer layer, that outer connective tissue of the bone. And there are a number of bony outgrowths that are referred to as crests, trochanters, tubercles, tuberosities that serve as these attachments for muscles throughout the body. Skeletal muscles are named a number of different are named according to a number of different criteria. Some muscles are named by location. For example, the intercostal muscle, inter meaning between, costal referring to the ribs and the costal cartilages of the ribs. These are muscles that are located in between each pair of ribs, and that contributes to the motion of the thoracic of the rib cage. In terms of the shape of the muscle, some muscles are named according to their shape. For example, the deltoid muscle, a major muscle of the shoulder, is triangular shaped, and so the term deltoid refers to triangular. Some muscles are named after their relative size. One example is the gluteus maximus, is the relatively large muscle in comparison to two other similarly named muscles, namely the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus, which in terms of size are relatively and progressively smaller than the large gluteus maximus. The direction of the fascicles and the muscle fibers are often used to name muscles. For example, a muscle in the abdominal region, the rectus abdominis, is named according to the direction, and that these are muscle fibers that tend to have a straight line appearance, which is the definition of the term rectus. Some muscles are just named after the location of attachments onto the bone. For example, the brachioradialis is reference to the radius of the forearm for one of the attachments of this muscle, and the brachial portion is referring to the brachium as the other attachment. Some muscles have more than one origin. For example, the biceps, bi for two, indicates this muscle has two separate sites of attachment on the origin. And some muscles are named after the action or the movement those muscles generate. For example, the adductor brevis is a muscle in the lower extremity that, when it contracts, will adduct the leg, the thigh, and so that will move the leg towards the midline of the body in the frontal plane. Some other key definitions to understand about muscles here include the term prime movers, and so the term suggests that we're referring to a muscle that is responsible for generating a particular movement, and so that would be the muscle, or sometimes a pair of muscles, that are the major ones involved in generating that movement. Antagonists are muscles that opposes or reverses a particular movement. Synergists are muscles that have the same effect in terms of the movement, and that these muscles act synergistically, that when these muscles are activated at the same time will increase the overall force application to a bone and produce a relatively stronger movement. For example, if we think about elbow flexion, this motion is generated by the biceps brachii, the brachialis muscle, and the brachioradialis muscle. So as a result, these three separate muscles, as they all function to produce elbow flexion, are considered synergists. A fixator is a term referring to a muscle, these muscles rather, that are synergists, that function to immobilize a bone or a muscle's origin to provide a stable base of support or to help a person maintain upright posture. In terms, once again here, just to review the naming of skeletal muscles, some of the ways in which that's done. The number of origins, as pointed out on slide number 7, bi for 2 origins. Sometimes we have a tri, where there are 3 separate origins for a muscle that we would refer to it as triceps. In terms of the location of attachments, once again, sometimes muscles are named according to the point of origin or the point of insertion, and the action. So whether a muscle produces a flexion movement or an extension movement, sometimes that muscle or that group of muscles are referred to as flexors or as extensors. And typically muscles contract where the insertion moves towards the origin. So muscles undergo a change in shape, they get shorter, and that typically occurs where the insertion moves towards the origin for the most part. In this illustration, we're going to show the difference between synergists and antagonists. And if we imagine an elbow flexion maneuver, so we have a rotation where the forearm is moving closer to the upper arm, so this is elbow flexion, and that comes by way of these blue arrows, which indicate that a force generated inside these muscles are being transmitted through the tendon to the bone and is going to pull the bone, attempt to pull the bone along the line of these muscles, but because these bones are connected to the humerus, we end up with a rotation effect. Now in this case, the flexors include the biceps brachii and the brachialis in this particular illustration, and so we can refer to these muscles as prime movers. These are the ones primarily involved in generating the flexion, and because they're two separate muscles, we can say they're both synergists as well. Now, as we perform that elbow flexion, we take a look on the opposite side of the arm, and we have the elbow extensors, the triceps brachii, tri indicating three points of origin. The diagram here only illustrates two of them, but there are three. And this particular muscle group is antagonistic to the flexors. So when we want to perform an elbow flexion, typically the antagonists are relaxed while the flexors are contracting in order to produce that actual flexion movement. Just one more coverage here of the different shapes of muscles, and the shapes of the muscles will often dictate the mechanics of that muscle. And so we see here that we have some muscle located in the oral region, the facial region, where the orbicularis oris is skeletal muscle that is circular in shape, and when this muscle contracts, it will close the oral cavity. We have a shape that is convergent. One example of this is the pectoralis major. This is B that we see over here. And when this muscle, we have a number of muscle fibers at different angles that converge onto one tendon. In C here, we have what is described as parallel muscle shape, and the parallel suggests that the fascicles, the bundles of muscle fibers, are parallel to the full axis of the muscle. So if you imagine tendon muscle to tendon, we have a very straight line muscle, and the fascicles, the muscle fibers, are aligned with the long axis of that muscle, and that's what we see here in the thigh. And this particular muscle is the sartorius muscle, which also happens to be the longest muscle in the human body. We take a look at D. We have what are called unipennate muscles, and the extensor digitorum longus that we'll cover a little bit later in this unit, highlighted here on the anterior side of the lower leg. We have muscle fibers that are aligned at an angle to the full length of the muscle. So if you imagine the full length of the muscle, proximal to distal, the actual muscle fibers are aligned at an angle to the long axis. A bipennate muscle, as you can see here in E, the rectus femoris, this is one of the thigh muscles, is bipennate, which means it has two of these portions of the muscle that have fibers at different angles to the long axis of the muscle. So when you think about the long axis of the muscle, think about drawing a straight line from tendon through to the tendon along the body where it's located, but the actual fibers do not run that length. They're actually at different angles. And so in this particular case of a bipennate muscle, the term central tendon is usually to define that tendon that does span at least some distance in between the muscle bellies. A fusiform muscle, the biceps brachii, is an example of a fusiform muscle, which is a muscle that is spindle shaped, as the definition of fusiform. And the last shape here is multipennate in comparison to a unipennate and a bipennate muscle, where the deltoid muscle does have that triangular shape, but there are different clusters of that muscle that have more than two different directions of the fibers that converge to that tendon where it attaches onto the humerus. Contrast G with B, where the pectoralis major does have those fibers that converge to a tendon, but these fibers are all part of one major muscle belly, where we have distinctive muscle bellies in a multipennate muscle. So this ends our second introductory video to skeletal muscle.